cold marble bit through the thin soles of my shoes. I was a bride, but this felt like an execution. Diego Ramos didn't want a wife. He wanted a hostage. He married me to destroy my family, to break my father's legacy piece by piece. He thought I was a pampered princess collateral damage in a mob war. He didn't know the truth. He wouldn't know until the wedding dress came off, and he saw exactly what I was hiding. Silence hung in the cathedral, heavy and expensive. 200 guests packed the pews wearing designer suits and suffocating silk dresses, projecting an air of celebration that tasted entirely like copper and dread. I stood at the altar. My veil was heavy, a suffocating layer of antique lace that obscured the stained glass light filtering through the high windows. Beside me stood Diego Ramos. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a man evaluating a real estate acquisition. "Do you, Navy Martin, take this man?" The priest's voice droned on, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I didn't hear the words. I was too focused on the pressure in my ribs, the stiff boning of the bespoke corset digging into my skin. The dress was a masterpiece of concealment. Long lace sleeves, a high Victorian collar that choked the base of my throat, a flowing skirt that brushed the floor. The fashion magazines had called it a bold, modest statement by the heiress of the Martin Empire. Diego just thought I was a prude. He shifted his weight. I could smell him bergamot sharp tobacco and the cold scent of ozone that always seemed to cling to men who carried guns. He didn't look at me. His dark eyes were fixed straight ahead on the gilded crucifix, though I doubted he believed in any god but himself. He was 32, inheriting the Ramos syndicate after my father orchestrated a hit that took out his uncle. The war between our families had bled the city dry for 3 years. Diners shot up, docks burned, politicians bought and subsequently buried. It only ended when my father had a stroke, leaving the Martin Empire in the trembling, incompetent hands of my older brother Thomas. Thomas lasted 4 months before he bankrupted our defense fund and lost the southern ports. Begging for a truce, Thomas offered Diego everything: money, territory, ships. Diego declined. He asked for me. "I do," I said. My voice didn't shake. It came out flat, hollowed out by years of practice. Diego finally turned his head. His jaw was a sharp, unforgiving line. He took my left hand. His fingers were calloused, wrapping around my knuckles with enough force to remind me he could break them if he chose to. He slid the ring onto my finger. It was platinum set with a diamond, so large it looked ridiculous, heavy enough to bruise. "A brand. Mine," he murmured, his voice so low only I could hear it over the choir, that suddenly erupted into a hymn. It wasn't a sweet nothing. It was a receipt of purchase. "Yours," I echoed back. I looked up into his eyes. They were the color of black coffee, completely devoid of warmth. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. That bothered him. I saw the slight tightening of his eyes, the tiny muscle feathering at his temple. He expected a weeping bride. He expected a terrified girl trembling under the weight of her cruel mafioso husband. He wanted me to be afraid. He wanted to enjoy breaking the spoiled Martin princess to get back at the men who raised her. He had no idea that my father had already broken me long before Diego ever learned my name. The priest pronounced us husband and wife. Diego lifted my veil. He didn't bother with gentleness, flipping the antique lace back over my head. He leaned in. I braced myself, locking my knees. His lips brushed mine, dry, firm, and entirely perfunctory. The kiss lasted 2 seconds. A flashbulb popped in the periphery. "Smile, Mrs. Ramos," he whispered against my cheek, his breath warm on my skin. "Your brother is watching. We want him to know how happy you are." I pulled back just enough to look at him. I curved my lips into a shallow, empty smile. "I'm ecstatic, Diego." He stared at me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then he offered his arm. I took it. We turned to face the congregation. 200 faces stared back. Some looked pitying. Most looked relieved that the war was over, even if the peace treaty was wearing white. I spotted Thomas in the third row. He was sweating, dabbing his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He couldn't meet my eyes. He looked at the floor, chewing on his lower lip. Coward. He sold me to save his own skin, convinced he was throwing his beloved, sheltered sister to the wolves. I didn't feel angry at Thomas. I didn't feel much of anything. You can't betray someone who already expects the worst from you. We walked down the aisle. The heavy fabric of my skirt dragged against the stone. With every step, the coarse lining of the dress rubbed against my shoulders and back, sending dull spikes of pain radiating down my spine. I kept my posture perfect. Shoulders back, chin up. A marten doesn't slouch. A marten doesn't show pain. We stepped out of the heavy wooden doors and into the biting November air. The sky was an iron sheet. Black SUVs idled at the curb. Diego's hand slid from my arm to the small of my back. He meant it as a possessive gesture for the cameras, a heavy hand guiding his property into the car. He pressed his palm firmly against the center of my spine. I suppressed a sharp intake of breath, locking my jaw so tight my teeth ached. The pressure was right over the worst of it. I forced myself to step forward, smoothly, sliding into the leather seats of the car without a sound. Diego climbed in beside me, bringing the cold air in with him. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the crowd. "Comfortable?" he asked, not looking at me. He opened a compartment and pulled out a crystal decanter of whiskey, pouring 2 fingers into a glass. "Perfectly," I lied. He knocked back the drink. He didn't offer me one. The reception was held at the Ramos estate, a sprawling fortress-like mansion perched on the cliffs just outside the city. It was entirely too modern for my taste. Lots of glass, steel, and black marble. It looked like a museum where nothing was allowed to be touched. The ballroom was a sea of excess. Chandelier light fractured off champagne flutes and diamond necklaces. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying trays of caviar and oysters. For 3 hours I was a prop. Diego paraded me from table to table. He introduced me to men with thick necks and broken noses, men who wore custom suits, but still looked like they could kill a man with a bare hands. He introduced me to a senator who sweated through his collar and a police commissioner who couldn't look me in the eye. "My wife, Navy," Diego said over and over. His hand remained firmly planted on the small of my back, right over the hidden ridges of my skin. Every time he pressed down, a phantom burn flared up my spine. I drank 4 glasses of champagne just to numb the edges of the physical pain. "She's beautiful, Dom," a man named Sal murmured, kissing my hand. His eyes flicked over my modest dress with thinly veiled disappointment. "Very traditional." "Navy is a woman of high standards," Diego replied smoothly. His tone was a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "Sheltered, protected. Her father kept her in a very gilded cage." I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the bubbles burn the back of my throat. If only you knew, I thought. Across the room, Thomas was getting drunk. I watched him stumble slightly as he leaned against the mahogany bar. He was laughing too loudly at a joke told by one of Diego's capos. Diego followed my gaze. He leaned down, his mouth hovering right next to my ear. "He's pathetic," Diego murmured. "Your father built an empire, and your brother traded it for a bottle of scotch and a few more years of breathing." "Thomas is not my father," I said evenly. I didn't defend him. There was no point. "No, he's not," Diego agreed. "But he loves you. You're the golden girl. the untouched Martin princess. I saw the way he cried when I handed him the contract. It killed him to give you to me. I turned my head slightly, bringing my face inches from his. Then he's a very good actor, because Thomas would sell his own soul if it kept his hands clean. Diego's eyes narrowed. He was searching my face for a crack, for a tear, for the panic he so desperately wanted to see. I gave him nothing. My face was a mask of polite boredom. "You're very composed," he said. It sounded like an accusation. "It's a party, Diego. Should I be screaming?" He chuckled a dark, humorless sound. "The night is young navy." A waiter passed by, and I swapped my empty glass for a full one. The weight of the dress was becoming unbearable. The high lace collar was chafing my neck, and the heavy velvet and silk skirts felt like they weighed 50 pounds. Underneath it all, the friction against my scarred back was starting to make me feel genuinely nauseous. "Dance with me," Diego ordered. It wasn't a request. He pulled me toward the center of the room. The band was playing a slow, mournful jazz tune. He pulled me close. Too close. His arm wrapped tightly around my waist, his other hand clasping mine. "You're stiff," he noted, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I don't like dancing. I think you don't like me. I think we both know my preferences aren't relevant." I met his gaze squarely. "You wanted a hostage. You have one. Stop pretending this is a romance." A flash of genuine anger crossed his face, quickly masked by a cold smile. "I want to break your father's legacy navy, and you are the prettiest piece of it. When I look at you, I see everything he valued: perfection, status, wealth. I'm going to strip it all away." I almost laughed. I truly almost laughed in his face. Perfection. My father valued perfection, all right. That's why he made sure nobody ever saw what happened when perfection wasn't met. "Good luck with that," I whispered. The song ended. Diego stepped back, his eyes dark with a promise of violence. "Go upstairs. The master suite is at the end of the hall. Wait for me." "Are we done parading?" "We're done with the public part of the evening." His gaze dropped to the high collar of my dress, lingering on the intricate buttons down my chest. "Now comes the private part." I turned on my heel and walked away. I didn't look back at Thomas. I didn't look at any of the guests. I walked out of the ballroom, my spine perfectly straight, ignoring the agonizing burn beneath the silk. The master suite was freezing. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, cooling a room that was entirely grayscale. Charcoal walls, a massive unmade bed with slate-grey sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the crashing black waves of the Atlantic. It was a beautiful room, completely devoid of life. I stood in the center of the plush rug and finally let my shoulders drop. Pain flared immediately, sharp and hot. I hissed through my teeth, reaching back to rub my neck, careful not to snag the delicate lace. I was exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the ceremony and the reception was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. I walked over to the windows and looked out at the water. I didn't know what to expect from Diego. Violence, assault, cold indifference. Honestly, I preferred indifference. If he hit me, it wouldn't be anything I hadn't survived before. The heavy oak door clicked open. I didn't turn around. I listened to his heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor, then the muffled sound as he stepped onto the rug. "You didn't run," Diego said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "To where?" I asked, watching his reflection in the glass. He had taken off his suit jacket and unbuttoned his collar, loosening his tie. He looked tired, but the predatory edge was still there. "Most girls in your position would be plotting an escape, or crying in the bathroom. I'm not most girls." He walked up behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat radiating from him. No, you're a martyr. Arrogant to the end, I finally turned to face him. He was holding a glass of amber liquid. He took a sip, his eyes raking over my dress with blatant distaste. "Take it off," he said. The command hung in the air. This was it. The moment of humiliation he had been waiting for all day. The conquering king claiming his spoils. I looked at him. "Are you sure?" He frowned. "Do not test my patience tonight, Navy. I am not a kind man. You are my wife. You are in my bedroom. Take the dress off." I didn't argue. My fingers went to the high collar at my throat. I started to unfasten the tiny pearl buttons. 1, 2, 3. Diego watched, his expression impassive, though a muscle feathered in his jaw again. He expected smooth, flawless skin. He expected the untouched porcelain of a girl who had spent her life being manicured, massaged, and protected by bodyguards. He expected to taint something pure to spite the man who killed his uncle. I unbuttoned the cuffs of my long sleeves. I reached around to my back, finding the hidden zipper. It was stiff. I struggled with it for a moment, my arms aching from the tension of the day. Diego sighed an irritated sound. He set his glass down on a side table and stepped forward. "Turn around." I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then I turned my back to him. His warm hands brushed my skin as he found the zipper. I closed my eyes, bracing for the shift in the air. He pulled the zipper down. It made a long, smooth sound, parting the heavy fabric down the center of my spine, all the way to the small of my back. The heavy silk and lace lost its structure. I shrugged my shoulders, letting the top half of the dress fall forward. It pooled around my waist. The cold air of the room hit my bare back. The silence that followed was total. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. I stood there staring at the dark window, waiting. Diego didn't speak. He didn't move. I could hear his breathing, which had suddenly stopped and then resumed, shallow and sharp. My back was a map of atrocities. From the base of my neck down to my hips, the skin was a jagged landscape of old violence. Thick, roped scars from a riding crop crisscrossed my shoulder blades. Paler, smoother patches of skin near my ribs told the story of third-degree burns, the result of a spilled pot of boiling water that was entirely intentional. On my left shoulder, a raised, ugly starburst marked the place where my father had stubbed out his cigar when I was 16, just to see if I would cry. I never cried. That only made him hit me harder. This was the legacy of Arthur Martin. This was what he did behind closed doors when a business deal fell through, or when Thomas failed a math test, or when my mother looked at him wrong. Thomas always hid. I always stepped in the way, and they called me the pampered princess. "What?" Diego's voice was a harsh whisper. It didn't sound like the confident mob boss from the altar. It sounded like a man who had just stepped off a cliff. I didn't turn around. I kept my arms crossed over my chest, holding the front of the dress up, shivering slightly in the air conditioning. He took a step closer. I felt the warmth of his hand, hovering inches from my skin, refusing to touch, as if he was afraid I would shatter. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising thick with a sudden chaotic emotion. "Who did this to you?" I slowly turned around to face him. I let the dress fall entirely, stepping out of the puddle of white silk. I stood before him in plain white underwear, stripped of the armor I had worn my entire life. Diego stared at me. His eyes roamed from my scarred shoulders to the faded bruises on my collarbone, down to the burn marks on my ribs. The cruelty that had lived in his eyes all day was entirely gone. It was replaced by a profound, horrifying shock. "You thought my father kept me in a gilded cage," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady. "You thought you were stealing his most prized possession. You wanted to ruin me, Diego." I stepped closer to him. He actually took a half step back, his eyes locked on the violence carved into my flesh. "Look closely," I whispered. I was already ruined. Diego looked from my scars up to my face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The great, terrifying Diego Ramos, the man who had burned down half the city for revenge, looked entirely lost. "Your father!" Diego stammered the pieces, clicking together in his head. The isolation, the high-necked clothes, Thomas's desperation. Arthur did this. Arthur, Thomas's enemies, anyone who needed a punching bag. I picked up a silk robe from the end of the bed and slid it over my shoulders, tying it loosely at the waist. The soft fabric felt like heaven against my raw skin. I looked at my new husband. "So, if you're planning to beat me, Diego, you're going to have to get in line. And if you're planning to break my spirit to hurt my family, you're a fool. They don't care about me. They gave me to you because I was the only piece of garbage they had left to throw away." I walked over to the bed, pulled back the heavy slate-grey covers and climbed in. I didn't look at him again. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging my side of the room into darkness. "Good night, Diego." He stood in the center of the room for a long time. I listened to his breathing. He didn't come to the bed. He didn't say a word. After 20 minutes, I heard the heavy clink of crystal as he poured himself another drink. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the armchair by the window in the dark, watching me until the sun came up. Morning arrived without an apology. Grey light filtered through the massive windows, harsh and unforgiving against my tired eyes. I hadn't slept much. Every time I drifted off, the phantom weight of my father's cane settled across my shoulders, jerking me awake in a cold sweat. I sat up, pulling the silk robe tight across my chest. The armchair by the window was empty. Diego was gone. A heavy crystal glass sat on the side table, completely drained. A knock sounded at the door. 2 sharp raps. "Come in," I said, my voice raspy. Diego opened the door. He was dressed in dark denim and a black Henley, looking less like a Mafia boss and more like a man who spent his weekends rebuilding engines. He carried a tray, a silver carafe of coffee, 2 mugs, and a plate of plain toast. He set it down on the edge of the mattress. He didn't look at my face right away. His eyes fell to the collar of my robe, then to the floor. "Black," he said, nodding to the carafe. "I didn't know how you'd take it." "Black is fine." I reached for a mug. My hand trembled slightly from the drop in my blood sugar, but I steadied it before he could notice. He poured the coffee. He handed it to me, his fingers deliberately avoiding mine. He pulled up a heavy wooden chair from the vanity and sat facing the bed, leaning his forearms on his knees. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a rough stubble coated his jawline. "Did Arthur use a knife?" he asked. No preamble, no "good morning." I took a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter, scalding hot. A riding crop, the leather handle mostly. Sometimes the braided end, if he had been drinking gin instead of scotch. Diego's jaw tightened. "And the burns?" "A kettle." I was 19. I told him I didn't want to marry the shipping heir he had picked out for me. "He tortured you over a business merger." "He punished me for disobedience," I corrected quietly. In his mind, there was a difference. Martins are assets. Assets must perform. Diego stared at me. He was a man who ordered executions. He oversaw a syndicate that moved weapons, drugs, and illicit money across 3 state lines. He was intimately familiar with violence, but the violence he knew was transactional. A debt unpaid, a territory encroached. He didn't understand the intimate, suffocating cruelty of a father destroying his own child behind locked doors. Where was Thomas? Diego's voice dropped an octave, scraping against the walls of the room. Upstairs, or out at a club. I set the mug down on the tray. Thomas learned early that if he stayed quiet, Arthur wouldn't look at him. I was the shield. If Arthur was busy hitting me, he wasn't looking at Thomas's gambling debts or his failed exams. Thomas didn't cause the bruises, Diego. He just profited from them. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I bought you to hurt them, Diego finally admitted. He didn't look away. I wanted to take Arthur's pristine, perfect daughter and drag her into the mud. I wanted Thomas to lie awake at night, knowing his sister was locked in a house with a monster. You succeeded. No. He stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood. No, I didn't. Because they didn't give a damn about you. Thomas didn't cry at the meeting because he was losing a sister. He cried because he was relieved. He began to pace the length of the room. His hands were curled into tight fists. They used you to pay off a debt. They handed you over to me, knowing what I am knowing, what my reputation is, because they figured I would just finish the job Arthur started. It's a very efficient business model, I said. Diego stopped pacing. He turned to me, his eyes burning with a sudden, terrifying intensity. Stop doing that. Doing what? Talking like you're reading a grocery list. You're talking about your own torture navy. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to scream. Screaming never stopped the belt, Diego. I pulled my knees to my chest. It only made it last longer. You learn to detach. You learn to float above it. He walked slowly back to the bed. He stopped inches from where I sat. You don't have to float anymore. I looked up at him, studying the hard lines of his face. What does that mean? It means my war with the Martins just changed. He reached down, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before resting his large, rough hand gently on the top of my head. He didn't pet my hair. He just let the weight of his palm rest there, a grounding force. Nobody touches you in this house, Navy. Nobody. Not my men. Not me. I didn't lean into the touch, but I didn't pull away either. I am your wife. A Mafia wife has obligations. My only obligation right now is figuring out how to dismantle your brother without killing him too quickly. Diego pulled his hand back and walked toward the door. Get dressed. Wear something soft. We have a meeting with my capos in an hour, and I want you sitting right next to me. He walked out, shutting the door quietly behind him. 2 days passed in a strange, suffocating limbo. The sprawling Ramos estate felt less like a prison and more like a quarantine zone. The house staff treated me with extreme caution. Maids averted their eyes when I walked down the hallways. The private chef prepared delicate, mild meals, asking me 3 times a day if I was comfortable. Word had spread. Not about the scars Diego kept that entirely to himself, but something in his demeanor had shifted, and his men felt it. He had brought a Martin into the house, a woman they had spent 3 years hating, and instead of treating me like a prisoner of war, he was treating me like a fragile piece of explosive ordnance. I hated it. I was used to being invisible. Now I was under a microscope. Thursday afternoon, I sat in the library. It was a beautiful room, lined with first editions, and smelling of old paper and leather. I was trying to read a biography, but my back was aching. A dull, throbbing pain radiated from my shoulder blades, aggravated by the rainstorm battering the windows outside. The change in barometric pressure always made the older scars ache. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Sal walked in. He was Diego's underboss, a man built like a brick wall, with a flattened nose and eyes that held zero warmth. He had kissed my hand at the wedding, but I knew he was the one who orchestrated the hit on Thomas's shipping yards last year. "Mrs. Ramos," Sal said. He didn't sound respectful. He sounded like he was chewing on glass. "Sal." I kept my eyes on my book. He walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't ask if I minded. "Dom's out at the docks, asked me to check in on the new acquisition." I turned the page. "I am perfectly fine. You can report back that the acquisition hasn't broken anything." Sal chuckled a wet, ugly sound. He walked closer, stopping a few feet from my armchair. "You've got a smart mouth for a girl whose family just surrendered. Arthur must have spoiled you rotten, kept you wrapped in silk while my men were taking bullets in the street." I carefully placed a bookmark between the pages and closed the book. I looked up at him. "Arthur Martin is dead. The war is over. Your boss signed the treaty. Treaties are paper." Sal took a sip of his drink. He leaned in, his voice dropping. "You think because you got a ring on your finger, you're one of us. You're a hostage, sweetheart. A pretty little bargaining chip. Don't get comfortable." "Sal," the voice came from the doorway. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. Diego stood there. His coat was wet with rain. His eyes were fixed on his underboss, and they were completely devoid of mercy. Sal stiffened. "Dom, I was just... Step away from my wife. We were just talking, giving her the lay of the land." Diego walked into the room. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying grace of a predator that has already cornered its prey. He stopped right in front of Sal. "Did I ask you to speak to her?" Diego asked quietly. "No, boss." "Did I ask you to educate her on her status in my home?" Sal swallowed hard. "No." Diego reached out and took the whiskey glass from Sal's hand. He set it on the table. "Navy is not a hostage. She is not a Martin anymore. She is a Ramos. If you look at her wrong, if you speak to her with anything less than absolute respect, I will take your tongue out of your mouth. Do you understand me?" Sal paled. He looked from Diego to me, then back to Diego. "I understand." "Get out." Sal didn't hesitate. He practically ran out of the library, shutting the doors behind him. Diego stood there for a moment, letting out a slow breath. He ran a hand through his damp hair. He turned to me. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I was handling it," I said defensively. "I'm not a child. I've dealt with men much worse than Sal." "I know you have." He walked over to the armchair opposite mine and sat down heavily. "But you don't have to deal with them here. This is my house. You are under my protection." "I didn't ask for your protection." "You didn't have to." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked glass jar. He set it on the coffee table between us. "What is that?" I asked. "Arnica and calendula salve. I had a doctor mix it. It's for burn tissue and deep tissue scarring. It helps with inflammation when the weather turns cold." I stared at the little jar. My throat tightened inexplicably. For years I had stolen cheap lotion from the pharmacy to rub on my back in secret, hiding the tubes in the hollowed-out base of my lamp. Nobody had ever offered me medicine. Nobody had ever acknowledged the pain out loud. I started, but my voice cracked. I cleared my throat, forcing the emotion down. "I don't need it. Navy." Diego leaned forward. His eyes were surprisingly gentle. "You're sitting rigid. You've been shifting your weight every 2 minutes since I walked in. You are in pain. It's nothing I can't handle. I know you can handle it. I'm asking you to let me help." I looked at his hands. They were violent hands. They had ruined lives. They had ordered the deaths of my father's men. But right now they were resting casually on his knees, offering a jar of healing cream without any expectation. "I can't reach the middle of my back," I admitted quietly. It was the most vulnerable thing I had said to another human being in 10 years. Diego stood up. "Turn around." I hesitated. I looked at the library doors. "I locked them when I came in," he said softly. Slowly I stood. I turned my back to him. I was wearing a loose cashmere sweater. I pulled the hem up, exposing the jagged, ruined skin of my lower back. I closed my eyes, waiting for the disgust, waiting for the flinch. I felt the cool, smooth texture of the salve against my skin. Diego's fingers were incredibly gentle. He didn't press. He didn't rub too hard. He worked the ointment into the worst of the raised scars, his touch, clinical but steady. "Your brother," Diego said quietly, his thumb tracing the edge of a particularly ugly burn. "What about him? He called today. He wanted to know if the merger of our shell companies was going through smoothly." Diego paused, his fingers resting against my spine. "He didn't ask how you were." A bitter smile touched my lips. "I told you, I'm a discarded asset." Diego smoothed the sweater back down over my hips. He stepped back. I turned around to face him. "He's wrong," Diego said. His eyes were dark, a storm brewing in the black depths. "You are not discarded. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. And Thomas Martin is going to bleed for what he let happen to you." Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room, blurring the lights of the city across the bay into angry yellow smears. Tonight the Ramos estate was playing host. Thomas was coming to dinner. I sat at the foot of the long mahogany table. Diego sat at the head. Between us stretched 12 feet of polished wood-silver candelabras and crystal wine glasses. I wore a dark emerald blouse, silk, and high-necked, tucked into tailored black trousers. It felt like armor. Diego had left it on my bed that afternoon without a note. It fit perfectly, concealing every inch of my ruined skin while projecting an absolute icy authority. "He's going to be late," Diego noted, checking his watch. It was a heavy silver piece that caught the candlelight. "It's a power play, a weak one." "He's terrified," I corrected softly. "He's sitting in his car at the bottom of the driveway, drinking from a flask, trying to stop his hands from shaking." Diego looked down the length of the table at me. The harsh lines of his face softened just a fraction. "You know him well." I survived him. 10 minutes later, the heavy double doors swung open. Sal escorted my brother into the room. Thomas looked exactly as I remembered him, yet somehow diminished. His expensive charcoal suit hung a little looser on his frame. His blonde hair was slicked back, but a faint sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes darting from Diego to me. He expected to see a broken girl. He expected a bruised cheek, a hunched posture, the familiar, terrified sister who had always absorbed the blows of our family's dysfunction. I sat perfectly straight. I didn't smile. I didn't break eye contact. I just watched him sweat. "Diego." Thomas said, his voice a little too loud, too hearty. "Apologies for the delay. Traffic on the bridge was a nightmare." "Sit down, Thomas," Diego said. It wasn't an invitation. Thomas pulled out a chair near the center of the table, equidistant from both of us. A maid silently appeared, filling his water glass, and pouring him a generous measure of Barolo. Thomas drank half the wine before he even unfolded his napkin. The first course was served in suffocating silence, seared scallops on a bed of sweet corn puree. I cut mine methodically, eating small bites, tasting absolutely nothing. The merger is proceeding well. Thomas started his fork, scraping loudly against his porcelain plate. My lawyers sent over the final shell company filings this morning. Everything is clean. The southern ports are yours to operate through. I saw the filings, Diego replied. He hadn't touched his food. He was resting his chin on his steepled fingers, watching Thomas the way a biologist watches a rat in a maze. They were sloppy. Your legal team left a paper trail a mile wide regarding the offshore accounts. Thomas paled. He set his fork down. We can clean that up. It's just a clerical oversight. In my business, clerical oversights put people in federal prison. Diego leaned back in his chair. You aren't taking this seriously, Thomas. You think because you gave me your sister, your debt is paid, and you get to play sloppy. Thomas swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to me, desperate for a lifeline. Navy. Tell him. Tell him how our father ran the books. We always kept a secondary ledger. Do not speak to my wife, Diego interrupted. His voice barely rose above a conversational murmur, but it hit the room like a physical shockwave. Thomas froze, his mouth half open. You address me. Diego continued, his eyes turning to flat, dead obsidian. If you need a glass of water, you ask me. If you want to discuss the weather, you ask me. You do not look at her. You do not invoke her name. She is no longer your shield, Thomas. The silence in the dining room became absolute. The only sound was the driving rain against the glass. I looked at my brother. For the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. He wasn't a commanding Mafia scion. He was a frightened, pathetic boy, wearing his dead father's suit. He had sold me to this monster to save himself completely ignorant of the fact that he had actually handed me the keys to his own destruction. Understood, Thomas whispered, staring intently at his plate. Good. Diego picked up his wine glass. Because the terms of our arrangement have changed. Thomas's head snapped up. Changed, we signed a contract. A contract predicated on the assumption that the asset you handed over was delivered in pristine condition. Diego took a slow sip of his wine. You sold me damaged goods, Thomas. The air left my lungs. My hands gripped the edge of the table beneath the linen cloth. I looked at Diego, a sudden flare of panic igniting in my chest. Was he doing this? Was he going to humiliate me in front of the brother who had let it happen? Diego didn't look at me. He kept his ruthless gaze locked on Thomas. I don't know what you mean, Thomas stammered, wiping his brow with his napkin. You know exactly what I mean. I know what Arthur did. I know what you allowed to happen. Diego's voice dropped, vibrating with a cold, controlled fury. I married a Martin to acquire leverage. I didn't realize I was marrying a survivor of a torture chamber that you helped cover up. Thomas was trembling now. He gripped the edge of the table. That was our father. That wasn't me. I couldn't stop Arthur. Nobody could stop Arthur. You didn't try, I said, my voice cut through the room, quiet and steady. Both men looked at me. You didn't try, Thomas, I repeated. I let go of the table and rested my hands gracefully on my lap. You turned up the music in your bedroom. You went out to the clubs. You spent the money he made from his violence, and you ignored the cost. Navy, please, Thomas begged, his voice cracking. I was a kid. I was younger. I held his gaze until he couldn't take it anymore. He looked down, completely defeated. Because of your failure to disclose the condition of the Martin estate, Diego said, cleanly returning to business, "I am restructuring our deal. I am taking the northern warehouses. I am liquidating your offshore Cayman accounts. You will retain a 2% silent partnership in the legitimate construction firms. Everything else belongs to me." 2%, Thomas gasped. That's nothing. That barely covers the property taxes on the family house. I'll be bankrupt in 6 months. "Then I suggest you sell the house," Diego said. "Dinner is over. Sal will show you out." The front door slammed heavily, the sound echoing through the cavernous foyer of the Ramos estate. Thomas was gone. I remained sitting at the long dining table. My plate of cold scallops sat in front of me, untouched. My heart was beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs, but the rest of my body felt strangely numb. Diego stood up from his end of the table. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the sideboard, poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a heavy crystal glass, and carried it over to me. He set it down next to my water goblet. "Drink it," he ordered softly. I wrapped my fingers around the glass. The amber liquid burned going down, leaving a trail of necessary heat in my stomach. Diego pulled out the chair directly next to mine and sat down. The vast distance of the 12-foot table was gone. He was close enough that I could smell the bergamot and rain on his skin. "You're angry," he stated, watching my profile. "You used my scars as a bargaining chip," I said. I didn't yell. The exhaustion was too heavy for anger. "You weaponized the worst parts of my life to steal a few more warehouses. I weaponized Thomas's guilt to ruin him." Diego leaned closer. "I didn't need the warehouses, Navy. I have enough money to buy this city twice over. I took them because taking his money is the only way to hurt a Martin. I took his pride. I took his safety net." I turned to look at him. "Why? Because he watched you bleed and did nothing." The absolute certainty in his voice made my throat ache. I looked down at my hands, tracing the rim of the bourbon glass. "You don't have to defend me, Diego. I'm not a charity case." "I know you aren't." He reached out his knuckles, brushing lightly against the silk of my sleeve. "You're the strongest person in this house. You sat across from the man who let you be destroyed and didn't even blink. But you shouldn't have to fight them alone anymore." He withdrew his hand and reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick, watermarked paper. He slid it across the polished mahogany until it rested in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, looking at the document without touching it. "The deed to the Martin family home," Diego said. I snapped my head up to look at him. "What?" "I bought it this morning, through a shell corporation. Thomas was drowning in debt he didn't want to tell me about, leveraged against the house. I bought the debt. I foreclosed on it privately." Diego tapped the paper. "It's in your name, Navy. The house where Arthur hurt you. The house where Thomas hid. It belongs to you entirely." I stared at the heavy black ink on the paper. My name. Navy Martin Ramos. Attached to the property that had been my prison for 24 years. The sprawling estate with the basement where my father kept his canes. My breath hitched. I pressed my hand flat against the document, feeling the raised seal of the notary. "Why would you give me this? I never want to step foot in that place again." "I know," Diego said quietly. "That's why I also brought this." He reached into his pocket again. This time, he pulled out a matte black Zippo lighter. He set it on top of the deed. The heavy metal made a sharp clack against the wood. I looked at the lighter. Then I looked at Diego. His dark eyes were utterly serious, devoid of any cruelty or manipulation. He wasn't playing a game. "Burn the deed," he said. Sell the land to developers, or drive over there tonight with this lighter and a can of gasoline and burn the physical house to the foundation. I have a crew ready to make sure the fire department takes their time responding." A violent, jagged laugh ripped out of my throat before I could stop it. It was a terrible sound, half sob, half hysteria. I covered my mouth with my hand, shaking my head. "You are insane," I whispered. "I'm thorough," Diego corrected. "You have spent your entire life absorbing pain so that other people could maintain their empires. It's time you destroyed an empire of your own." I picked up the zipper. It was heavy in my palm. The metal was still warm from his body heat. I flipped the lid open. The sharp tang of lighter fluid hit the air. I flicked the flint. A small, perfect yellow flame bloomed in the dim dining room. I stared at the fire. For years I had dreamed of that house burning. I had lain awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, wishing a stray spark from the fireplace would catch the Persian rugs. I wished it would turn the mahogany staircases to ash. I wished it would erase the memories carved into the walls and my own skin. Diego watched me watch the flame. He didn't push. He didn't rush me. He simply sat beside me, offering me the destruction I had never been allowed to want. I snapped the lid shut. The flame vanished. "Not tonight," I said, my voice steadying. "If I burn it down tonight, Thomas will know it was a reaction. I want him to pack his bags. I want him to walk out the front door, knowing he has nowhere to go. I want to wait until he is entirely broken. Then I'll burn it." Diego's mouth curved into a slow, dark smile. It was the first time I had ever seen a genuine expression on his face, and it was entirely lethal. "You," he murmured, his voice thick with a dark, profound respect, "are a terrifying woman, Navy Ramos." "I had a good teacher," I replied, sliding the deed and the lighter into my pocket. I stood up from the table. My back ached, a dull throb reminding me of the scars hidden beneath the expensive silk. But for the first time in my life, the weight of them didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a receipt for a debt that was finally being paid. "Come on," I said, looking down at my husband. "Show me the rest of your ledgers. Let's see what else my brother has left to lose." 6 weeks later, winter settled over the city, turning the harbor into a frozen sheet of grey steel. Thomas was out. His eviction was executed quietly, ruthlessly, and with a total lack of dignity. Sal's men had changed the locks on the Martin estate, while Thomas was downtown, pleading with a bankruptcy judge. When my brother returned, he found 2 suitcases sitting on the snow-covered curb. Everything else belonged to the bank. Everything else belonged to me. We drove there at midnight. Diego drove himself, dismissing his security detail for the night. The black SUV idled halfway up the long, winding driveway. The Martin house loomed at the crest of the hill, an imposing Tudor monstrosity of stone and heavy timber. It looked entirely dead. No lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimneys. I unbuckled my seatbelt. My hands were perfectly steady. "You don't have to go inside," Diego said. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the dark silhouette of the roofline. "We can do it from out here." "No," I replied, grabbing the heavy metal flashlight from the center console. "I need to see it empty." We walked up the stone steps together. The biting wind whipped my heavy wool coat around my knees. Diego unlocked the heavy oak door with a brass key, pushing it open. It groaned in protest. The air inside was stale freezing and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. My father's scent was gone. I clicked on the flashlight, cutting a sharp beam through the oppressive darkness. I walked through the grand foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the marble tile. I moved into the formal living room. Sheet covers draped the velvet furniture like ghosts. I kept walking, passing the grand staircase, heading straight for the back of the house. Diego followed close behind. I could hear his steady breathing. He didn't ask where we were going. He already knew. I stopped in front of a heavy, unremarkable door near the kitchen. The basement. I reached out and turned the brass knob. It was unlocked. The wooden stairs creaked as I descended into the damp, concrete-lined space. This was where Arthur handled his private business. A heavy oak desk sat in the center of the room. Behind it, a rack of hunting rifles, and beside the desk, a tall, narrow glass cabinet. I aimed the flashlight at the cabinet. Inside sat a collection of canes and riding crops, polished mahogany, braided leather, silver-tipped handles. Arthur called it his collection of discipline. My chest tightened, a phantom reflex from a frightened child who had spent too many hours shivering on this concrete floor. I swallowed hard, forcing the panic down into a tiny locked box in my mind. Diego stepped around me. He didn't hesitate. He picked up a heavy iron fire poker resting against the brick wall. With one brutal swing, he shattered the glass front of the cabinet. The crash was deafening in the enclosed space. Shards of glass rained down onto the concrete. He dropped the poker. He reached into the broken cabinet and pulled out the braided leather riding crop. He held it in his large, scarred hands, staring at it for a long, silent moment. His jaw tightened so severely I thought his teeth might crack. Without a word, he bent the crop over his knee. The rigid internal core snapped with a sharp crack. He threw the broken pieces onto the concrete floor. He moved methodically. He pulled out the mahogany canes, snapping them against the edge of the heavy desk. He tore the leather straps apart with his bare hands. He reduced my father's tools of torture to splintered wood and shredded hide, his breathing heavy, his eyes pitch black with a terrifying focused rage. I watched him destroy the monsters of my childhood. I didn't cry, but the invisible bands, tightening around my ribs for the past 15 years, finally snapped. I took a deep, dragging breath, filling my lungs completely for the very first time. Diego turned back to me. His chest heaved beneath his dark coat. He looked down at the wreckage on the floor, then up at my face. "Are we done here?" he asked roughly. I pulled the matte black Zippo lighter from my coat pocket. Almost. We walked back upstairs. Diego retrieved 2 heavy red canisters from the trunk of the SUV. We walked through the main floor, soaking the imported Persian rugs, the velvet drapes, the antique mahogany furniture. The harsh chemical smell of gasoline quickly overpowered the stale air. We stepped out the front door, standing on the edge of the snow-covered porch. I flicked the Zippo open. The flint sparked, catching the wick. The small yellow flame danced against the biting winter wind. "Arthur Martin built this house to last a century," I murmured. "Arthur Martin was an arrogant fool," Diego replied, stepping close behind me. His chest pressed against my back, a solid, unmovable shield against the cold. I tossed the lighter through the open front doors. The ignition was instantaneous. A heavy, concussive whoosh sucked the oxygen from the porch. A wall of blue and orange fire erupted in the foyer, racing up the grand staircase and devouring the antique wood. Heat slammed into my face, driving the winter chill away entirely. We walked backwards down the driveway, the snow crunching beneath our boots. We stood by the SUV and watched it burn. The flames chewed through the roof, sending a massive pillar of black smoke into the night sky. The heat was immense. It cracked the upper windows, sending showers of glass onto the frozen lawn. Sirens wailed in the far distance, but they were miles away. By the time they arrived, there would be nothing left but a stone foundation and a pile of ash. I leaned back against the hood of the car. Diego stood beside me, our shoulders touching. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice low over the roar of the fire. I watched the roof cave in a shower of golden sparks erupting into the black sky. "Warm," I said. We returned to the cliffside estate, smelling of gasoline and wood smoke. The massive house was quiet, the staff long asleep. We walked upstairs to the master suite in silence. The adrenaline of the fire was fading, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating exhaustion I had carried my entire life. It was a clean slate, an empty room waiting to be furnished. I went straight to the master bathroom. I turned the shower on as hot as it would go, stripping off my smoke-ruined clothes and leaving them in a pile on the tile floor. I stood under the scalding spray for a long time. I scrubbed my skin until it was red, washing away the smell of the fire, washing away the lingering ghost of the Martin name. I closed my eyes, letting the water drum against my scarred back, embracing the physical sensation without fear. When I stepped out and wrapped myself in a heavy towel, I found Diego sitting on the edge of the large bed in the adjoining room. He had showered in the guest suite. He wore grey sweatpants, his broad chest bare, his dark hair damp. He was staring at his hands, turning a heavy silver ring around his index finger. I walked into the room, stopping a few feet away from him. He looked up. His eyes travelled over me, taking in my damp hair, the flush of my skin, the towel clutched to my chest. He didn't look at me with pity. He didn't look at me like an acquisition. He looked at me with a profound, terrifying hunger that he was holding back with iron discipline. "You should sleep," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's been a long night." "I don't want to sleep." I loosened my grip on the towel. Diego's jaw clenched. He stood up slowly, the distance between us, suddenly feeling incredibly small. "Navy, don't do this out of gratitude. I didn't burn that house down to earn a reward. I did it because it needed to burn." "I know," I replied. I let the towel drop. It pooled at my feet on the thick rug. I stood completely bare in the dim light of the bedroom. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't hide. I didn't turn my back to hide the jagged ruins of my skin. I forced myself to stand tall, exposed, letting him see exactly what I was. Diego didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He closed the distance between us, his heavy treads entirely silent on the rug. He stopped inches away from me. He reached out his warm, calloused hands, resting lightly on my hips. "You are beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with absolute sincerity. "I'm a disaster." I whispered, the cynical defense mechanism flaring up one last time. "You're a survivor." He leaned down. His lips brushed the faded starburst burn on my left collarbone. He didn't kiss it with pity. He kissed it with reverence, a worshipper at a ruined altar. My breath hitched. My hands found his shoulders, gripping the solid, heavy muscle to steady myself. He moved his mouth up the column of my neck, his hands tracing the curve of my waist, gently pulling me against him. The heat of his body was overwhelming. The smell of bergamot and clean soap grounded me in the present moment, anchoring me to reality. "Nobody hurts you again," he whispered against my jawline, his breath sending shivers down my spine. "Nobody takes from you. You are my wife. You are my equal. This empire is yours." "Show me," I challenged, pulling his face down to mine. He kissed me. There was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a claiming, but it wasn't a theft. It was an offering. His mouth was hard and demanding, matching the frantic energy humming beneath my skin. I kissed him back, pouring years of repressed anger, survival, and a desperate need to feel alive into the connection. He lifted me effortlessly, carrying me to the bed. The slate-grey sheets were cool against my skin. Diego followed me down his weight a heavy, comforting blanket. He mapped every inch of my body, completely unfazed by the uneven texture of my back, treating the scars not as tragic flaws, but as medals of a war I had survived. For the first time in 24 years, I wasn't floating above the pain. I wasn't detached. I was entirely present, anchored to the bed by the heavy, consuming heat of my husband. We didn't speak. We communicated in harsh breaths, tangled limbs, and a desperate, blinding intimacy that erased the boundaries between us. He broke me down not with violence, but with a relentless, devastating gentleness that demanded I stop hiding. When it was over, I lay against his chest, the heavy, rhythmic beat of his heart thrumming against my ear. His hand rested on my bare back, his thumb idly tracing a long, jagged scar across my shoulder blade. I didn't flinch away from the touch. I leaned into it. "Thomas will try to retaliate," I murmured into the darkness of the room. "Let him try," Diego said lazily, his fingers stroking my hair. "He has no money, no men. He's a ghost. He's a desperate ghost. They're the dangerous kind." Diego shifted slightly, kissing the top of my head. "You let me worry about Thomas. You focus on deciding what color you want to paint the walls in the West Wing. I hate the beige." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that actually reached my eyes. It felt foreign, pulling at muscles I hadn't used in a decade. My father had sold me to a monster, hoping to break my spirit and save his weak son. He had sent me into the lion's den, entirely convinced I would be devoured. Arthur Martin made a terrible miscalculation. He didn't realize that when you lock a bruised, battered girl in a cage with a monster, she doesn't get eaten. If she's smart enough, she learns to speak the monster's language. She learns to bare her teeth. And eventually, she learns how to rule the den alongside him. If you loved this incredible conclusion to Navy and Diego's dark romance story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Did you expect Diego to go to such lengths for Navy's revenge? Drop a comment below with your favorite moment from their story. We love hearing your thoughts. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow dark romance fans. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next thrilling Mafia tale.